Have you ever imagined waking up and discovering that the United States is on the brink of energy collapse? Well, that's exactly what could be happening now. OPEC has just dealt a strategic blow to U.S. oil, and a shocked Canada may be about to make a historic decision, cutting off oil supplies to Americans once and for all. If this happens, we are facing the end of Canada's dependence on the U.S. and the beginning of a new era in the global energy market. The Canada versus U.S. trade war may have just begun, and OPEC has just dealt the first big blow. By drastically reducing oil production, producing countries force a shortage that causes prices to soar. And who else feels this impact? The United States. Without this oil, the American economy could collapse, forcing the government to look for desperate alternatives. But here's the problem. Is there still a way out? Canada has already realized that it no longer needs the USA. With new trade alliances being formed, such as the Kanzuk bloc, the country may be on the verge of becoming an independent power, freeing itself from American influence. But this decision does not come without risks. What if Canada actually cuts its exports to the United States? What happens to the price of fuel? How will the American population react to seeing gasoline prices soaring and transportation costs exploding? The power game is intensifying, and Canada may, indeed, abandon the USA for good. Trump, who once dictated the rules of the energy market, may be losing control over oil, and what once seemed unthinkable is now increasingly real. OPEC changed the oil game, and Canada could be the key player in this new global order. If Canadian oil is diverted to other countries, such as Europe and Asia, the United States could face a historic recession. The stage is set, tension is in the air, and the burning question is, how far can this trade war go? And more importantly, is the U.S. ready to face this new reality? If you are concerned about the U.S. financial crisis and the impact of Trump's abusive measures, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Here we keep you updated on every twist and turn of this power play. The first signs of this crisis are already appearing, and the American population is beginning to feel the impact directly in their pockets. With OPEC reducing oil supply, fuel prices are skyrocketing, and it doesn't take long for the ripple effect to hit every sector of the economy. Fueling a car already costs more, transport companies increase their fares, supermarkets adjust food prices, and even electricity bills go up. The American middle class, which had already been fighting inflation, now faces a new enemy: uncertainty. And the big question is, how far can this go? Economists warn that this rise in prices could lead to an unprecedented recession. When the cost of oil rises, the entire production chain is affected. Companies that rely on transportation to distribute their products face increasingly higher costs, and many are already passing this expense on to consumers. The result? Rising inflation, reduced purchasing power, and an increasingly unstable market. In states like California and New York, gas stations are already recording daily increases, and drivers are beginning to feel the weight of decisions being made on a global stage on a daily basis. What if the crisis deepens? If Canada actually decides to cut its exports to the United States, prices could explode to levels never seen before. Americans are already struggling to balance their finances, and this new turn of events could be the final blow to an economy still trying to recover from the last few turbulent years. Experts warn that we are facing a decisive moment. Either the U.S. finds a way out of this energy crisis, or it prepares for an impact that could forever change its position on the global stage. Is economic collapse a real possibility? Time will tell, but one thing is certain: this crisis is just beginning. Faced with this chaotic scenario, the American government finds itself cornered and is desperately seeking a way out to avoid a total energy collapse. The immediate solution? Increase domestic oil production through shale exploration. But here's the problem. Extracting oil from shale isn't as simple as it seems. Unlike conventional oil, this process involves extremely high costs, requires complex infrastructure, and still faces strong environmental resistance. What's more, if oil prices fall again due to an OPEC maneuver, or even a possible strategic move by Canada, shale extraction could become simply unsustainable. This means that the United States may be betting all its chips on a plan that was already a failure. As OPEC hammers the U.S. with this strategic reduction in global oil supply, Canada finds itself in a decisive position. The country, which for decades provided cheap oil to Americans, now realizes that it no longer needs to depend economically on the United States. Domestic political pressure is growing, and many voices are already calling for Canada to cut off oil supplies to the United States once and for all. If this happens, there is no doubt the U.S. oil crisis will reach even more alarming levels, and the American economy could suffer disastrous consequences. Trump, who previously boasted of having complete control over the energy sector, now sees his power crumbling, with no concrete options to reverse the situation. The Canada versus U.S. trade war has never been so intense, and this could be the trigger for a historic shift in the global balance of power. With the advancement of the CANZUK alliance, Canada may be on the path to becoming an independent energy power, aligning itself with new trading partners and leaving the United States increasingly isolated. Canada's rise as a global power could completely redefine the energy market, and if the U.S. loses access to Canadian oil, will it be able to survive without this crucial source of supply? OPEC has already shown that it can change the rules of the game whenever it wants, and now Canada may be ready to deliver its own blow to the American economy. But the most worrying question remains: what happens if the shale fails? With extremely high extraction costs and increasingly questionable economic viability, the United States may be facing a dead end. The pressure on the government only increases, while inflation soars and the population's despair grows. Are we seeing the beginning of a new oil world order? Or will the U.S. be able to reinvent itself and find a way out of this unprecedented energy crisis? As the United States struggles to contain the oil crisis, a new threat looms on the horizon that could further accelerate its energy collapse. The electric vehicle revolution is progressing apace, and more countries are announcing plans to phase out gasoline-powered cars. Canada, for example, is already investing heavily in infrastructure for the energy transition, reducing its dependence on American oil and opening the door to a more sustainable market. If this trend continues, oil demand could plummet, making the U.S. even more vulnerable. Are we witnessing the beginning of the end of the oil era? OPEC hits the U.S. by reducing production, making fuel more expensive, while the automobile industry adapts to a new reality. Large automakers, such as Tesla, Ford, and GM, are already betting on the growth of electric vehicles, and countries such as the United Kingdom and Germany have set deadlines to ban combustion cars. What once seemed like a distant plan has now become a frantic race for energy independence. This puts the United States in a delicate position. If oil loses ground in the global market and Canada cuts its exports to the USA once and for all, what will be the future of the American economy? The oil crisis in the U.S. is not just about rising prices. It is a structural transformation that can change the entire global dynamic. Canada, once seen as a faithful supplier of oil to Americans, now realizes that it no longer needs the U.S. With CANZUK gaining strength and the possibility of new energy alliances with Europe and Asia, Canada could abandon the United States for good and become an independent global power. Does this mean Canadian oil can take down the U.S.? If the United States is left without its main oil supplier, while demand for fossil fuels declines globally, it could face even greater economic isolation. The Canada versus U.S. trade war intensifies with each new move. Trump loses power over oil, and his influence over the energy market dissolves in the face of the rise of electric vehicles. But what does this mean in practice? For Americans, it means a future of uncertainty, where an oil shortage could be just the first step toward a deeper recession. For Canada, it means a unique opportunity to free itself once and for all from dependence on the USA and lead a new chapter in the history of global energy. OPEC has changed the oil game, and now Canada can decide which side it will play on. But the big question is, if the US can't adapt quickly, will it still have a place in this new global energy order? Are you prepared to leave your car in the garage and take public transport? Yes or no? With gasoline reaching unsustainable prices, this may be the only way out. Canada watches the global chaos unfold and realizes this could be its big chance to break free from the US once and for all. The US oil crisis made it clear that American dependence is not a safe path for the Canadian economy. Faced with the Canada versus USA trade war, the country has already started exploring new alternatives, and one of them is CANZUK, an alliance that could completely change the energy game. If this union strengthens, Canada can not only reduce its dependence on the US, but also emerge as an independent global power, capable of dictating its own rules in the energy market. But the question that echoes among experts is clear. Will Canada remain hostage to the United States, or will it seek, once and for all, its energy independence? OPEC hits the US by reducing supply, and now Canada must decide whether to continue being the energy support for a country on the brink of collapse, or whether to follow a new path. With oil prices fluctuating violently, exporting to the USA is no longer so advantageous. The European and Asian markets are promising alternatives, and if Canada cuts its exports to the United States, the impacts will be catastrophic for the American economy. Can Canadian oil take down the US? The answer may be closer than many imagine. Canada's rise as a global power is becoming an increasingly hot topic. Previously seen only as a supplier of raw materials to the Americans, the country is now seeking autonomy. The movement is not only strategic, but also a response to American instability. Trump loses power over oil, and U.S. influence over its trading partners is rapidly weakening. If Americans used to dictate the rules, they now find themselves hostage to an economy that they can no longer control. What happens if Canada stops selling oil to the U.S.? This scenario could turn into one of the greatest challenges in American history, forcing the government to take desperate measures to avoid an energy collapse. The end of Canada's dependence on the U.S. seems inevitable. Each new decision taken by Ottawa reinforces the idea that the country is increasingly distant from American influence. OPEC has changed the oil game, and now Canada can decide whether to play against the U.S. or remain a weakened ally. But the reality is that Americans are isolated, and the trade war that could change everything has already begun. Can Canada abandon the U.S. for good? If political and economic movements continue in this direction, this could be the new reality for a country that has always been in the shadow of the American giant, but which could now be about to become a protagonist on the global energy scene. OPEC has changed the oil game in ways few expected, and the United States is increasingly feeling the pressure of this new reality. By reducing production, the organization not only raised global prices, but also exposed the vulnerability of Americans, who now find themselves on the brink of energy collapse. Trump loses power over oil, and his influence over producing countries is rapidly dissolving. Canada, which has provided the U.S. with cheap and reliable oil for decades, is beginning to see a future where it no longer needs that market, and where it can become an independent global power. But there is one crucial detail. If Canada stops selling oil to the U.S., what happens? The answer is not encouraging for Americans. The impact of a Canada free from American influence would be devastating for the United States. With OPEC hammering the U.S. and reducing global supply, Canadian oil becomes a key piece in this geopolitical chess. China and India, always on the lookout for new opportunities, are already positioning themselves to secure advantageous agreements with Canada. And if this move comes to fruition, the United States will be isolated from one of its largest sources of energy. This situation exposes how dependent Americans have become on the stability of the oil market, and now that that stability has been destroyed, the U.S. oil crisis could turn into something even worse than expected. Meanwhile, the Canada versus U.S. trade war reaches new heights. Canada realizes that it has the power to decide its own future, and that new alliances like CANZUK could be the key to its rise as a global power. The possibility of a united Canada with the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand puts even more pressure on the Americans, who see their international influence rapidly dissipating. If the U.S. loses Canada as an oil supplier, will it be able to maintain its leading position in the global market? Or are we witnessing the birth of a new world oil order, where OPEC and Canada decide the rules of the game? The answer to these questions becomes increasingly evident. OPEC not only played strategically to weaken American production, but also opened the door for a new group of energy powers to emerge. And while the United States tries to react, reality sets in. Absolute control over the global oil market may be slipping out of its hands. Can Canada abandon the U.S. for good? If the scenario continues to unfold at this pace, this may be the only logical choice for a country that has finally realized that it can grow without depending on the American giant. If Canada does decide to cut its oil exports to the United States, the impact will be immediate and devastating. The U.S. oil crisis would reach a new level, with fuel prices spiking between 20% and 30% in a matter of weeks. Filled gas stations, truck drivers facing unsustainable costs, and consumers feeling the weight in their pockets. And that's just the beginning. American dependence on Canadian oil has always been underestimated. But now, with Canada breaking free from the US, this fragile relationship is about to fall apart. OPEC takes a swing at the US, and what seemed like absolute dominance of the global energy market has now turned into a real threat to the American economy. If oil prices skyrocket, the entire system starts to collapse. The automotive industry, highly dependent on cheap fuel, would see a drastic decline in sales. The agricultural sector, which depends on diesel-powered machinery, would have high production costs, directly affecting the price of food. And for the population, an increasingly high cost of living as the US desperately tries to find a solution to avoid an even greater economic crisis. But the big problem is that the solution may not exist. If Canada stops selling oil to the US, what happens? Simple. Americans will have to resort to more expensive imports from other countries, further increasing their vulnerability. Meanwhile, Canada could redirect its production to Europe and Asia, strengthening new partnerships and leaving the United States isolated. The global energy market is changing, and Americans may be losing their place. The Canada versus US trade war could be just the beginning of a new scenario where Washington no longer dictates the rules. And if Canada joins OPEC or consolidates its role in the CANZUK alliance, the United States could lose even more influence in the energy sector. Canada's rise as a global power has never seemed so real, and the big question now is, can the US survive without Canadian oil? The future of energy is changing before our eyes, and the United States is increasingly cornered. OPEC strikes the US, Canada cuts oil from the Americans, and what seemed to be an absolute dominance of the energy economy begins to crumble. The US oil crisis is intensifying, and now the big question is, how will Washington react? Can Canada abandon the US for good? Canada's rise as a global power is increasingly evident, and Americans may be on the brink of energy collapse. If OPEC, Canada, and the New World Oil Order call the shots, the United States could lose its leadership position. But what about Trump? Your next step is already being designed, and it could change everything. If you want to understand this decisive move and how it could affect the global economy, click on the video next door and see you there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates about this trade war that could change everything.